Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to do a top 10 list of movies. My top 10 all favorite of all time, of all epsilon of things. Normally, I think when looking at this, I think there's always movies that I tend to consistently go back to and have a measuring stick of where I deem a good movie to be. Or ultimately, I there's several movies that I keep bringing up because I enjoy them so well. I think ultimately is about that time to eventually come into a consensus of really just going and notching down a list of top 10 movies that I have really gone back to or enjoyed or ultimately can't avoid just because of how many numerous times that it's like, well, yeah, but it's not as good as this movie. It's not as great as this. I don't enjoy it as much as this. Like, there's several times where I tend to go out of my way to try to find that movie equivalent. I'm like, ooh, this movie is just like the movie that I loved or liked or this and that. So, dare in fact, let's drop that list down to ultimately to have a sound consensus of a top 10 movie of all time list. So people can ultimately know wherever I go into enjoying a movie, I think of these things first. So, let's go into number 10 first. As you can see, I have not shifted screen yet. I wonder why. 10 is actually a mystery movie. Because a lot of the times you can't come to a clear consensus of what is your least favorite film. Ultimately, I could put 10 at a number of different movies, but it would always be vastly different every time. It could be the movie Escape Room. It could be the Ryan Reynolds movie Buried. It could be the movie I saw fairly recently called The Hunt. It honestly could just be a number of things. It could be Jason Statham's Death Race. It ultimately could be uh, Michael Keaton's Batman movie. It ultimately could be Batman Returns. It ultimately could be a slew of movies that you have heard of or have never heard of. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I could say that the 10th movie has to be a mystery. Because when looking at it, I could have come up with 100 movies to slap on to number 10. So I don't want to pretend that I don't love film so much so that I can go and easily make a top 10 list. Because the least favorite movie would probably be my absolute favorite. So, number 10 is a mystery film, and it has to be so. Because, it's much easier to list 9 of my favorite films. So let's move on. Number 9 is a movie called Double Dragon, which probably sounds very odd to a lot of people. Ultimately, this is a movie that I had consistently, bizarrely, late at night, seen late at on TV. Ultimately, leading for me to absolutely needing to go out of my way to say that I had finally seen said film. So ultimately, I had to go out of my way to search engines, stuff like that, much before I was heavily going into movie apps and stuff like that. This was the very first movie that I had bought overseas. That was, of course, being able to be played in America. It was a Region 1 movie, which ultimately means USA and Canada, you can watch in those devices. Um, I bought that overseas. It took forever to get here. And then I bought the DVD of this movie. And I'm like, oh my god. Yeah, I have a copy of this movie. I can finally watch it in its entirety for the first time. And after doing so, man, was this movie great. God, we of course, it's a journey of two brothers finding of two separate medallions. Each one of these medallions has separate powers, have separate properties, and ultimately having one of the properties was a power of it was a soul power. To ultimately, when you would touch the medallion, you would go into other people's bodies, and then the other medallion had another kind of separate property as well, which I don't remember what that one was because most of the showcasing was of the soul medallion. Ultimately, when having this movie, it kind of does give me the feels of like the Power Rangers film. It ultimately reminds me of um so many other like interesting and or great fighting films. Like looking at it like Surf Ninjas or Three Ninjas or a lot of like this movie is like a gateway to nostalgia for other things. But I do really like the villain in this. Ultimately, the guy that you would otherwise probably know much more from the Judgment Day, Terminator 2 Judgment Day. He ultimately plays, I think, Shogun or something like that. Shogun, I believe. We also have Alyssa Milano in this movie, which was really great, and some things along those lines. When looking at this movie, I think the reason why it is probably at number 9 is because at some point it does get fairly slow. I think ultimately when it gets down to them actually needing desperately to get the other medallion and to be able to finally like put the two together, there is kind of a slow momentum of time. There is kind of um there is just kind of like, well, I guess we had the one medallion, I guess we just have to keep it safe. There is a lot of time of people consistently fighting, which I think is awesome within this movie. There's much more than fighting in this movie. There like becomes like a car chase. There's quite other few things going on in this movie. There are gang members that are just presented to be in this movie to fight crime in the cities. Um, yeah, I really do enjoy this movie. I believe you can, in all actuality, still see this film. Dare say, if you want to see it for probably free, you can probably go on Tubi, Tubi, and otherwise watch this for absolutely free to the second of this recording. It's been on Tubi since I've gotten on Tubi, so that's been quite a long stretch of time. So you can otherwise see Double Dragons for absolutely free if you download Tubi and watch a really great film that's really fun. I know this movie is probably very goofy, but I just enjoy how goofy and odd and weird this film is. So moving on. Number 8 is a Kellen Lutz film and Samuel Jackson, of course. This movie was done in 2011. I have to kind of say that because ultimately there is another Arena movie that exists. Arena 2011. Ultimately, a lot of fighting films honestly have me to break it down and say, hey, was this better than the movie Arena? This movie is a 1v1 versus combat fighting movie that has it to where there is a story to where you get to have Kellen Lutz be very sympathetic with his cellmate, which ultimately he eventually has to fight within this film. Within this movie, there are some times where the acting, I can honestly say, is bad at times. But I think that is what I also like about it as well. There are some goofy things in which things are said or things are done. But overall, I just feel that this movie is funny or fun or just one of a kind. There's so many scenes within this movie that I feel it's like, God, this is so good. This is so enjoyable. And I tend to just go back to it either with how even simple this movie is. It's simple but so effective. Um, it gets to the point of the journey of there being unbelievable odds stacked up against Kellen Lutz's character, to where ultimately not a lot of people win 5 fights, but this person has to, of course, win 10. Ultimately leading to this quite possible person that you would not think at all, with kind of the abilities that he has, being able to just start beating the crap out of people, but surefire enough he does. But once you get the other alternate side story that is also going on within this movie, kind of does go, oh, okay, well, I can understand this. We even actually, within this movie, we actually have the guy that actually plays Swamp Thing within this film who ends up fighting Kellen Lutz, which I thought was kind of cool. Um, yeah. Ultimately, yeah, there's several kind of people that ultimately throughout this movie I'm like, oh yeah, I know him from this, or yeah, I know her from that, or oh, I know this person, I'm very familiar with this actress or this actor or whatever. This movie is simple but effective, but at the end of the day, I could just say that it's a really fun action film. Moving on. Next up, I would have to say Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original film. Ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of people could ultimately be waiting at per breath, just be like, when is there going to be an Avengers film? When is there going to be a Marvel film? When is there going to be this? Um, who knows? That actually may come up. But at the end of the day, I could also say, for those movies, yeah, I would probably say that I do love them or I do like them. But when breaking this down, you have to like them. But it's not to say that these movies are going to be the greatest movies of all time in my mind. Because when looking at it, there needs to be just something more about those movies than just being like a grandiose overall battle. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is probably the most rewatchable film. It is probably the most memorable rewatchable film. This very first film has so much fun for a movie where it's guys in suits. This this movie has so many little small memorable things going on in an existence to really showcase its characters so well. At some times you can ultimately say it's like, well, hey, shouldn't any Avengers movies be better than this? I would say maybe, but when also looking at it, like Avengers kind of falls in the fact of a movie built over several years of time. When looking at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you can ultimately say that this movie was built off of a cartoon or off of a comic book or this and that. But when looking at it, this movie also not only has the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but it also has April O'Neil, it has Casey Jones, it has Shredder, it has The Foot, it has. And it has to have it to where ultimately there is such a long fight out. I like it to where you have mutant turtles or ninja turtles fighting against a common group of gang of thugs. I don't actually like it to where a team goes up against an alien race or some goofy demon dimensional thing. I like it to be just simple. I like it to be give me a gang of goofy looking, monstrous looking things and have them fight against uh, just thugs. You would think that, bizarrely, you can also almost see if you watch this movie, you can also kind of tilt it to just be like, well, hey, what if the Ninja Turtles are actually the monsters and the Foot are actually doing the right thing when looking at it? When looking at it, you can almost flip this entire movie to see that Shredder is trying to be the hero in this movie for humanity. Because you never really see the Turtles doing much but eating pizza. But, anyways, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles has several different things going on with it, and a lot of times people will say that this movie is also fairly slow. A lot of times when Raph is, dare say, in his tub, a lot of people are just like, man, this movie's slow. A lot of the times when they're training near April O'Neil's not so put together home, you can say that that's fairly slow. The whole time when they're huddled around the campfire getting their last words from Shredder, or Splitter. Not Shredder. What am I thinking? Splinter. You could say that ultimately this movie is fairly slow. But you can also say that Major League Butt Kicking is back in town. You can ultimately see that this movie is, from start to finish, a very fun adventure, even when the turtles are hiding from the humans. Even when they're waiting for pizza. Even when Raph is fighting Casey Jones. I'm like, God, this movie is so much fun. Simply put, when Raph consistently says damn in this movie, you can't help but say damn right, yeah. How Raph and Leonardo are set up so well to be at odds with one another, but ultimately are really family in this movie. That is such a great thing, and you get the. This is the only movie where you actually get to see Raph as this hot headed guy. Every other time, he's just. God, is he just annoying. But in this movie, you can really see him going on his own, doing his own thing, getting into trouble, making mistakes. Basically, for this movie, the Ninja Turtles are great separate, and then also great on their own, or great separated, but also great together, is what I meant to say. Um, Good all over, good all together. I think that's why this movie has stood the test of time, and that's why when the CGI movie came in, nobody wanted to do that film. Nobody wanted to be a part of that film. But a lot of people just wanted the checks, wanted the money, knowing full well this movie was never going to work, and it didn't. Yeah, they did a sequel, but that's just because people just wanted to know how this was going to go about. And then they realized that, of course, this was going to be a bad film. When the sequel landed, nobody was interested. But they were desperate to just see a Ninja Turtles film, I think. It was too long. So, yeah. I think ultimately, when looking back on it, even the Ninja Turtles movies, they are successful just eventually just because of how this movie was successful. Moving on. Berlin Syndrome. And a lot of people will be like, so what? Whenever I tune into Netflix, I'm always looking to see if this movie still exists on Netflix. Because this is overall my probably favorite Netflix film that I probably only saw once. But God, this story is so enjoyable. Just the brains that went into this film. For people that do not know about this movie, you need to go see this. For the love of God. Berlin Syndrome is a movie about a girl who ultimately goes out and eventually ties herself onto a man. And they go and they have a romantic getaway together within this guy's room. The only problem is that this girl is just like, well, yeah, I had my fun, but let's call it a wrap. Like, hey, let's just say, hey, see you later. And so the girl notices that the guy is not home. So eventually she just decides to otherwise go about her day and get out of the apartment. The only problem is she can't get out of the apartment. All of a sudden, stuff that she has is missing. All of a sudden, she is really trying her best to get out of this apartment. She is trying even to break windows. She's trying to see if she can unlock things. She's trying as desperately as possible to try to get out of this apartment. To where ultimately, when her man that she dare say went out of her way to love and kiss and hug and stuff, ultimately she mentions to him, yeah, bizarrely, I couldn't get out of your apartment. Hey, I'm not questioning anything, but yeah, how do I get out of here? And the man looks at her and says, yeah, that's never gonna happen. She's like, so what? Yeah. This movie is almost just like Escape Room. And I just feel it's such an intriguing movie. I know Escape Room is a pretty dang good movie, but when looking at this movie, just the simplicity of it alone is just, God, this was so enjoyable. And every single time I suggest anybody to watch a film, it's usually always this one right away. Um, I have always thought about this film and just the brain thought, the processes, and stuff like that ultimately bleeds into every other film that I ever talk about or review. I'm like, yeah, this isn't as smart as Berlin Syndrome, but man, is it pretty dang good. And ultimately, I probably would say, go out of my way to say that Berlin Syndrome probably isn't a great movie. Probably isn't a top 10 worthy list. But I insist that I just thoroughly enjoy this movie for everything that it offers. The intelligence of it, the really downright just story of which that this presents is just amazing. I just enjoy it. And so I consistently recommend it. So if you guys have not seen this movie, you need to go out of your way to see this film. I guarantee that you'll probably, not everyone will enjoy this film, but I hope that you will ultimately enjoy it. So moving on. The Family Man, a Nicolas Cage film. Ultimately, I would go out of my way to say at some point that this was my favorite film of all time. Funny enough, how this kind of slipped and fell a few slots past that. Ultimately, The Family Man is a movie about Nicolas Cage who ultimately decides to do one good deed. Because a lot of the other times, all he thinks about is how much money he can make, how much his company can make money. To where even on Christmas Eve, he pulls his entire company into a crazy strategy meeting to be able to continue to have his business make money. Within this movie, Nicolas Cage has to finally realize that there is something more than money. There is something more than being the richest man in the world, and that is to have a family. At the end of the day, I could say that a lot of people might not like Nicolas Cage. I will always defend Nicolas Cage for having very much memorable performances. Everything that he does is always memorable. And I always would point to people and mention this film as a very good Nicolas Cage film because for the longest time I would say that this would be my favorite movie of all time. But again, there are some times when there are other movies. Nicolas Cage in this movie gets a glimpse of having a family, a wife, 2 kids. Ultimately realizing that once he has to burdenly challenge himself to be a father, how he has to go through this lengthy, long amount of time grinding away at not being a rich man, not having the life of which he thought he wanted. Realizing eventually, once being stuck in a life of having a wife and kids and having a neighborhood that all was like, yeah, man, you're the shit. Because he was. He had the best life, and he didn't realize, and it took him forever to realize it. And he barely had $1 to his name. He a lot of times would work at this tire business at E.F. Hutton, and or whatever that tire company was. I've seen this so many times, but it's been a while since I've seen it. You get it to where there's so many memorable things about this movie, where you have Don Cheadle driving around in Nicolas Cage's Ferrari, and while Nicolas Cage's character was trying to figure out what is going on, as he ultimately has a panic attack within the car, and Don Cheadle is explaining to him that this is all a glimpse, that he needs to learn a thing or two because ultimately money isn't life. To where ultimately he goes out of his way when he gets back to his real life to kind of throw everything off to the wayside to otherwise reconnect with the world. This is such a great Nicolas Cage movie, and ultimately I would say that this movie is so close to being my favorite movie of all time, but looking at it, there are just better movies. There really are. So, if you guys have never seen this film, you're doing yourself a great disservice. This is a great Christmas movie. This is a great New Year's movie, but I would watch it consistently throughout any time of the year. Just because of how much I thoroughly love and enjoy this movie. So moving on. Captain America, the Winter Soldier, and Iron Man, the very first Iron Man, and the sequel, Winter Soldier of Captain America. Ultimately, a lot of people could ultimately shrug their shoulders and shrug their heads and whatever said, and just ultimately go out of their way to say, there's better Marvel films. Black Panther, this and that. There's better Marvel films. Ultimately, when looking at it, I think these Marvel films tie too much to me to honestly say nay. Captain America the Winter Soldier, honestly, to me, is the greatest Marvel film that I've seen of all time. And ultimately, there might be some movies that are just nostalgic to me that I'll ultimately go back to. But when looking at it, I also have to tie into the fact that for the longest time, whenever I would see a superhero movie, if it was not as good as the very first Iron Man, it wasn't a movie. Or it wasn't good. Iron Man is a great film that anyone can go back to at any time and just be like, yeah, it still holds up. It's still good. And it probably doesn't seem like a big, huge productional movie like The Winter Soldier, but god dang, are these movies is really good. Ultimately, a lot of people will go out of their way to say that there are better Marvel films, but to me, there will always be these films that were better than anything else. Avengers Endgame, sure, yeah, that was a great film. But when looking at it, it's not as good as either one of these. Avengers, not as good as these. Anything that you could put up against these Marvel films is just not as good as any of these. Any movie, any movie ultimately that's a superhero film is not going to be good as either one of these. No matter how good they are, by and large, these two movies are just so great. And ultimately, a lot of people will debate that to me. They'll just like, oh no, there's better. There's better. Believe me, there's better. No. I will go out of my way to say that these two films are the best Marvel films, if not the best superhero films of all time. Avengers Endgame is great, yes. Infinity War, sure. Avengers, yeah. Ultron, sure. This one, yeah, that one, but these are the best. These two here are the best Marvel films. Moving on. Ghostbusters 1 and 2. Honestly, these two films are my childhood favorites. I have probably seen both of these films hundreds upon hundreds of times. In my mind, looking at it, I adamantly had to take a day off from work when the video game of the Ghostbusters was released, so I could just play the video game, take a day off. Which a lot of people thought that was odd. I'm like, no, you don't realize how this movie is just my life. Like, these two films are the greatest thing that I have seen. And as far as comedy goes, as far as everything goes, God, do I love Ghostbusters 1 and 2. I go back to them all the time because it's always a fun movie. Every single day, this is going out of its way to be a fun film. I can at a lot of points just kind of regurgitate the lines within this movie. It's been a very long time because ultimately I could go out of my way to say I have every single holiday for the longest time popped in this film or any number of these films, either one of these films, and watch them. Because ultimately, they're on some channel somewhere for every single holiday. I went out of my way, especially on like Comedy Central, when Comedy Central was a thing. They would have Ghostbusters playing every holiday, and I would pop in and be like, "Yeah, it's still on somewhere." There was one time where I was at a gym and the sound wasn't on, and I was still watching the movie with no sound in a gym while I was working out, and I was still just like, I was still watching this movie, just going, "Yeah, I know that line. I know what he's gonna say." I can just enjoy it for the visual aspect because it was in a gym and the TVs don't have sound. So like ultimately I could have just like put up the volume and because there was nobody in the gym at that time, just be like, yeah, I'm watching Ghostbusters again in a gym. But yeah, it was awesome. It was great. And so ultimately I have such a tie to this film that I ultimately cannot on this list go out of my way to say that like that these are any lower than anything else that I've ever seen in my life because these movies are just so dang good. That ultimately the only problem with these films that aren't just my greatest all-time movie is just the fact that they've been sullied by sequels. They've been sullied by other things. They've been ultimately a lot of times there might be a supernatural movie that is quasi as good as these. So sometimes, like, I might want to pop in maybe the Ghost Rider movies just to see how goofy they were. Or I'll just watch other supernatural s like things or supernatural shows. Um, but it always comes back to this film. It always does. So, moving on. Fight Club. Fight Club. First rule of Fight Club is that you don't talk about Fight Club. Second rule of Fight Club is you get the point. I have now broken the first two rules of Fight Club. But looking at this, bizarrely, Fight Club was a movie that I didn't really know existed. I never really quite took the time to. Like, I heard about Fight Club, I'm like, yeah, it's a movie about two guys fighting in a basement. I don't know what this movie's about. I didn't really care what this movie was about. And one time I bizarrely just bought this movie. And later on in life, way later on in life, I just bought this movie just because I might have heard a thing or two about this film. I put it in. After I fully and fledgedly watched this entire film, I could not stop watching it. Like for an entire for months on end, I would just consistently go in and pop this movie back in and watch it again. I think there was like a strand of me watching this movie like 50 times through a couple of months. Just watching, I'm like, I gotta see this again. I gotta see this again. Man, this movie is so god dang good. Because it ultimately teaches you a life lesson. It makes you less stress. It makes you let go. It makes you realize that your life is ticking away a minute at a time. Like your life is going to end a minute at a time and stuff along those lines. Sometimes you need to really just let go, release, just end up having to do something you probably regret. But at the end of the day, this movie here, there was a job that I was not enjoying. Like it was really like it was a really painful job. It was really just like is this it's dry like this job was just driving me crazy. Fight Club was a way after seeing this film, I was just like, this movie is coming to me at a perfect time to realize that I need to let go of this job, that I need to find other things. Ultimately, when looking at it, when leaving that job to go to other things, I think that made my life a lot better. It made me feel a lot better about my life. And when ultimately coming back to that job, regardless, the job ended. And then I was just stuck with going back to other jobs that I gave up to keep going into them and just continue to get paychecks, which were very small and ridiculously ridiculous. But I kept doing them because I need the money. I needed the pay. And they ended up injuring me and costing me, and I still did them until ultimately I just like I I took those long years of retail and those long years of working, and they drove me mentally just crazy. So I just needed to eventually find some other way to let go. His name was Robert Paulson. Simplicity in just repeating a name over and over and over again. Simplicity in the fact that people are told to just, hey, go and start a fight with somebody and then lose. An obedience of people that realize that otherwise Tyler Durden is the effing guy, is the man. And at the end of the day, you could just say that he was two men. Because that is the big hook at the end of this movie. Funny enough how like Brad Pitt in this movie had never like within his career he has never been this so like seductive to people. I can't say another real Brad Pitt movie where he's kind of seductive to everyone. Females, males, everything in between. Brad Pitt is in this movie, but so is Edward Norton, because it has to be that way. Because they're one and the same. This movie is the dirtiest film that I've ever seen in my life. But god dang is it amazing. I know there's grungier films, there's darker films, there's this film, but you can never watch a movie that makes you rethink your life. You are not a beautiful and or unique snowflake. You are not your clothes. You are not your haircut. You're not your facial hair. You are not your car. You are not your home. You are not your khakis. Learn to let go, otherwise you're going to brew and just turn into a hermit. So at the end of the day, I could say that this is such a great film, just because of the message that it sends. So at the end of the day, let's move on. Ready Player One. I had just recently been able to watch this film. And I ultimately still ponder to this day if this movie, honestly, I could go out of my way to say is the greatest film that I've ever seen of all time. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah. I love video game movies, but there's never ever been a good one until now, until I've seen it in my life. Good God. To have a movie that has every seemingly property, character, thing in the world being presented within this movie. If you wanted to see a King Kong movie, you can watch this film. If you wanted to see a dinosaur movie, you can watch this film. If you want to see a Godzilla movie, you can watch this film. If you want to see a Back to the Future movie, you can watch this film. If you want to see a Steven Spielberg movie, over here. This movie, I would ultimately have had to have said that this movie would probably be like top 3 or top 5 or top 10. But when really breaking it down, I think I enjoy this movie much more so than anything else. So I think forcibly, this movie has to be my number one movie of all time. This has to be my new number one movie of all time. Because ultimately, I would have to say movies like Ghostbusters, movies like The Family Man would either be my favorite childhood movie of all time, or like The Family Man would be my greatest movie of all time. Well, the only thing is that Ready Player One just has too much of a good thing to just deny. It ultimately is a movie that is done in the future, which I didn't expect for me to enjoy a distant future movie, because ultimately I don't tend to enjoy those kinds of things. Again, I just don't. I never thought that a video game movie would be this good. I never thought that a movie done completely under a computer would be this good. But man, does it go out of its way to say, hey, it's gonna be that good. And this is also a Warner Brothers movie, which I was unexpecting a Warner Brothers movie to be that dang good. But it is. It really is. There's a lot of times when ultimately a lot of people could go out of their way to say, well, the book was better, or that this movie wasn't that good, because it's just a lot of, like, victory lapping that is going on with Steven Spielberg, having to victory lap over his greatest accomplishments and everything like that. But Darren fact, I feel that I enjoyed this movie for how, like, there's not everything that I enjoy about it. Like, there are portions of time when looking at it, there the very first way that this person ends up executing to get a bigger status in this world, in this oasis. Um, how the whole racing thing, I didn't enjoy that. I enjoyed how the race was first executed, but things that kind of happened after that was just kind of like, but everything that happens kind of after that, having a movie inside of a movie was kind of really cool and interesting. The very much retro vibe throughout this entire film is amazing. How it's just kind of giving you a VHS like cassette of a movie inside of a movie. I'm like, oh my god. God, they're just trying so much to get every retro S like feel of this film. Throwing out words like the old fashioned pop called tap to kind of, and breakfast clubs and this and that. Consistently mentioning and bringing up and having so many retro-esque like characters, horror film slasher characters presented, slotted in this film. Um, Having a number of different vehicles that were presented within the race that kind of got sprinkled in there a little bit here and there. To have, dare say, so many things on top of just overlapping, especially in big, huge battle-esh like scenes. Bringing up computer-esh like characters that had a huge amount of fame. bringing up in a small portion of thing Minecraft, just because. Um, Being to overall just bring up like you can pause and look at any point in time. You could be like, "Hey, God, isn't that Batgirl? Isn't that the Ninja Turtles? Isn't that the Transformer? Isn't that this? Isn't oh my God, is that a movie of which I never seen before, but I now want to go see because ultimately the people that bring up certain kind of references from certain kind of films, this movie makes for a one of a kind like review because there's so many people that know so much more about movies than I do, where they're going to point out different references that I didn't get. They're going to get different things and remember different things that I didn't. This movie, even though it is very much a Willy Wonka golden ticket-esque like journey, I really enjoyed it for what it is and what it ultimately should have led to other things, but it probably won't. Because heaven forbid they ever make other books of this, or of other movies, or other this and that. Because, Darren, fact, man, was this probably a huge ordeal to be able to execute and go out of your way to say that you did this at some point. Because, good God, to try to do it again and take probably years to try to accomplish this, or however long it took, just because most of it's done off of a computer. Man, if they ever were to ever try to do a sequel of this film, or even just reboot it, or do an animated something, do a cartoon of it, I would go out of my way to say, I want to go see that. I want to just see it. If it's bad, who cares? Because I ultimately just want to see some more of this. If it ever does be more. At the end of the day, that is my top 10 list of movies, and I probably just kind of went over them and just kind of gushed about how great they were, but I ultimately didn't probably go into every one of these. Some of these you might actually be able to say that you actually saw them. Some of them might actually be, honestly, Ready Player One might actually be a rental. But there might be a lot of movies that might just honestly just be rentals. There's been a lot of these movies where you can dare say they've been out for a super long time. So you can go on eBay and actually purchase a number of these for a super cheap price. There might be some apps out there like Vudu or Tubi, VUDO or TUBI that can otherwise you can watch a lot of films that I just mentioned for absolutely free or about a fairly cheap price. You could probably watch some of these on Amazon Prime, or you can probably watch some of these for, like I said, fairly cheap. So at the end of the day, I would honestly go and say, like, almost buy every single one of these. Own a real hard disk copy so you can watch it at any time. Drop whatever you're doing and just pop one of these in and just enjoy them for what they are. Berlin Syndrome, you can drop into Netflix and watch it at any point in time. So at the end of our time here, I just want to say bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.